The paradox at the heart of a superpower has the United States primarily fought for freedom or for dominance. This is a story of contradiction. A nation forged in the fire of revolution, one that declared its commitment to liberty, to justice, and to the inalienable rights of man, has, over nearly 250 years, become the most powerful military force the world has ever known. It has liberated millions and bombed millions, toppled tyrants and installed dictators, spread democracy and suppressed uprisings. Has America fought for liberty or for empire? The birth of a Siowan Terade IC2 Onwen, 13. Colonies declared independence from Great Britain in 1776. They did so with thunderous words about freedom. The Declaration of Independence was radical in its simplicity, that all men were created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But those words were written by slave owners. And while colonists demanded freedom from British taxation and monarchy, many were simultaneously expanding westward, often violently displacing indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands. The American Revolution was not just a fight for freedom from tyranny. It was also a blueprint for territorial expansion and control. Even as George Washington crossed the Delaware to defeat the British, settlers were crossing the Appalachians, encroaching on native lands. From the very beginning, liberty coexisted uneasily with conquest. 2. Military power born in war and grown through EXP and Inicio-Anaft. Independence. The young United States quickly discovered that military force was not just for defense. It was a tool for national growth. In the 1790s, American forces clashed with native tribes in the Northwest Territory. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers, 1794, the U.S. Army crushed native resistance, opening the Ohio Valley to white settlers. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the U.S. and brought new territory to be tamed through force. President Jefferson, champion of small government, sent the Navy to battle the Barbary pirates off the coast of North Africa, marking one of the first U.S. military operations overseas. Military power, whether by land, sea, or ideology, became the engine of expansion. American identity was becoming tied to conquest as much as to freedom. Manifest destiny, liberation, or occupation. By the mid-1800s, the term manifest destiny captured the American imagination. It was the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to spread from sea to shining sea. This belief justified war with Mexico in 1846. The U.S. annexed Texas, provoked border clashes, and launched an invasion deep into Mexican territory. The result? The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Mexico ceded half its territory, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, and more, in exchange for $15 million. To some, this was a triumph of American ambition and liberty. To others, it was theft, conquest, masquerading as destiny. The conquest also reignited debates over slavery. As Americans fought bitterly over whether new lands would be free or slaveholding, a clash that would culminate in civil war. For the Civil War, liberty or red fion it, the American Civil War remains the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history. At its core, it was a war about power, economics, and race. Initially fought to preserve the Union, it evolved into a war for emancipation. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 reframed the war's moral purpose. Over 180,000 black men joined the Union Army, fighting not just to defeat the Confederacy but to end slavery itself. For once, liberty was not just rhetoric, it was reality, paid for in blood. But even in victory, the contradiction endured. Former Confederates regained political control in the South. Reconstruction was crushed by white supremacist violence. Jim Crow laws replaced slavery with segregation. America claimed a moral victory, but its commitment to equality remained incomplete. V from Republic. To Empire, 1898, and the birth of global POWR in 1898. The United States defeated Spain in a brief war that transformed it into a global empire. Cuba was liberated but placed under heavy U.S. influence. Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines were annexed. The Philippine-American War, 1899 to 1902, saw over 200,000 Filipino deaths as they resisted U.S. occupation. American soldiers committed atrocities waterboarding prisoners, burning villages in what was officially labeled a war for civilization. Anti-imperialists like Twain decried the hypocrisy. How could a republic founded on liberty suppress self-rule abroad? And yet, the empire expanded. The U.S. built the Panama Canal. It meddled in Latin American politics. The Marine Corps became a global police force. VI, World Wars, defending freedom or strategic power. In World War I and again in World War II, America cast itself as the arsenal of democracy. In 1917, Woodrow Wilson said the U.S. would make the world safe for democracy. In 1941, Franklin D. Roosevelt said, America must defend four freedoms: speech, worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. These were righteous words. And in many ways, the cause was just. The U.S. helped defeat fascism. It liberated concentration camps. It rebuilt Europe through the Marshall Plan. But darker truths lingered. The U.S. interned Japanese Americans in prison camps at home. It firebombed Japanese cities and dropped 2 atomic bombs, killing hundreds of thousands. Black soldiers fought for democracy abroad while facing racism at home. America had saved democracy, but not without moral cost. 7. The Cold War, a global struggle with shadow, WARS, from 1947 to 1991. The United States waged a global struggle. Against the Soviet Union, it claimed to be defending freedom from communism. But in the name of liberty, it did many illiberal things. Backed coups in Iran, 1953. Guatemala, 1954. Chile, 1973. Trained death squads in Latin America. Supported brutal anti-communist regimes from the Shah of Iran to Suharto in Indonesia. And then came Vietnam. The U.S. sent over 500,000 troops. Millions of Vietnamese civilians were killed. Cajun Orange poisoned the land, and generations was Vietnam about defending freedom or defending influence. As dissent grew, so did disillusionment. The Pentagon Papers revealed lies. The public turned against the war. The myth of America as pure liberator cracked. VIII. The War on Terror. A new empire without BRTRs after 9/11. The United States invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. The justification was self-defense, counterterrorism, and the promotion of democracy. But the reality was murkier. Iraq had no WMDs. The war destabilized the region. Over 7,000 U.S. troops and hundreds of thousands of civilians died. Guantanamo Bay, black sites, and drone strikes became symbols of a shadow war, one where the line between freedom and force was often blurred. In Afghanistan, 20 years of conflict ended with the Taliban retaking power. What was gained? 9. The modern paradox, still a fight between ideals and ion Tays today. The United States maintains over 750 military bases around the world. It leads NATO, arms allies, and confronts rivals in cyberspace, airspace, and outer space. It backs Ukraine in its war against Russia, but struggles with its own democratic backsliding. It speaks of human rights, but sells weapons to authoritarian regimes. America remains both a symbol of hope and a source of fear. Its military footprint spans the globe, Yet its own citizens debate the cost of endless war. The question persists. Is the U.S. a defender of freedom or an empire in denial? Reflective, slow fade, every flag raised in victory casts a shadow. Every mission for liberty risks becoming a mission of control. The paradox is not new. It was there in 1776, and it's still here today. This documentary seeks to explore this contradiction, not to condemn, but to understand. To ask the question few dare to ask. Has America primarily fought for freedom or for dominance? Revolution for Freedom. 1775 to 1783, part of the series, Liberty or Empire. The real story of America's military conflicts firm. Reflective, in the spring of 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. What began as a colonial rebellion would become one of the most iconic revolutions in human history. But behind the muskets and manifestos, what was the true nature of the American Revolution? Was it a war for universal liberty, or a calculated bid for power by a new elite? The powder keg, colonial grievances, and British roulette. Seeds of rebellion. By the mid-18th century, Britain's American colonies had grown into thriving commercial hubs. But prosperity bred ambition and friction. Colonial merchants resented British trade restrictions. Landowners eyed the frontier beyond the Appalachians, blocked by British policy. Lawyers, printers, and radicals found inspiration in Enlightenment. IDEALSB, taxation without representation. The slogan would become iconic, but it wasn't simply about taxes. The colonies had long enjoyed autonomy through local assemblies. British efforts to tighten control after the French and Indian War, especially through the Stamp Act 1765 and Townshend Acts 1767, were seen as threats to self-rule. Stamp Act 1765 required stamps on printed materials from newspapers to legal contracts. The uproar was swift and widespread. Boston Massacre, 1770. British soldiers killed 5 colonists during a protest, becoming a propaganda rallying point. Act 1773 sparked the Boston Tea Party, a direct act of defiance. Coercive, intolerable acts, 1774, closed Boston's port and imposed military rule in Massachusetts. By 1775, the British Crown saw rebellion. The colonies saw tyranny. Lexington, Concord, and the call to arms. The shot heard round the world in April 19, 1775. British troops marched to confiscate weapons stored in Concord, Massachusetts. Colonial militiamen met them in Lexington. No one knows who fired the first shot, but the world changed forever. At Concord's North Bridge, colonial resistance escalated into full battle. British troops were forced to retreat to Boston under withering guerrilla fire. Rise of the Continental Army. The Second Continental Congress convened weeks later. A momentous decision followed: the formation of the Continental Army, with George Washington appointed Commander-in-Chief. It was no longer protest, it was war. Liberty for whom? The Revolution's great contradictions, slavery and the fight. For freedom of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, at least 41 owned enslaved people. Thomas Jefferson, author of All Men Are Created Equal, enslaved more than 600 people in his lifetime. Washington promised liberty while depending on enslaved labor at Mount Vernon. The Revolution inspired thousands of enslaved people to flee plantations. Some joined British lines after the Crown promised freedom. The Dunmore Proclamation 1775 offered freedom to enslaved people who fought for the British. In response, some American leaders promised the same, but often failed to deliver. Liberty was a rallying cry, but a conditional one. In the colonies, race, class, and gender determined who was entitled to it. Indigenous nations and the frontier war native tribes were caught in the middle of the colonial conflict, and most sided with the British. The British had restricted westward colonial expansion with the Proclamation Line of 1763. American settlers, especially from Virginia and Pennsylvania, ignored it. The Iroquois Confederacy split over. The war and raids intensified in the frontier. George Washington's orders led to the burning of Iroquois villages during the Sullivan Expedition 1779, one of the first instances of total war against native peoples. To many indigenous nations, a revolution was not a war for liberty, but a war for their land. Women of the Revolution, forgotten patriots women, played critical roles as spies, like Agent 355 of the Culper Ring, messengers and saboteurs, like Sybil Ludington, who rode farther than Paul Revere, camp followers, providing food and medical care, fundraisers, sewing flags, and supporting troops through political action, and yet they remained largely excluded from formal political rights after the war. The language of revolution inspired women to claim equality, but the revolution didn't answer. War on the battlefield, major campaigns, and turning points. Boston 1775 to 1776. The siege of Boston lasted months as American militia surrounded British troops. In March 1776, the British evacuated Boston after Washington fortified Dorchester Heights with cannons captured at Fort Ticonderoga, New York, and New Jersey. 1776 to 1777. British forces under General Howe nearly crushed Washington's army. The daring crossing of the Delaware and Battle of Trenton, December 1776, saved the Continental cause, both militarily and symbolically. See Saratoga, the turning point. 1777. British General Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga convinced France to join the war, transforming it into a global conflict. Valley Forge Winter, 1777 to 78. A brutal winter where more than 2,000 troops died of disease and starvation. Prussian officer Baron von Steuben trained the army into a professional fighting force. The Southern Campaign, 1780 to 1781. British victories at Charleston and Camden were followed by brutal guerrilla warfare. The tide turned at Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse. Washington and French forces converged on Cornwallis at Yorktown in 1781. International dimensions: France, Spain, and global stakes. French alliance: France secretly funded the colonies early in the war, then openly joined after Saratoga. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was critical at Yorktown. French troops, led by Lafayette and Rochambeau, fought alongside Amarca, Spain, and the Dutch Republic. Spain declared war on Britain in 1779, fighting in the Gulf of Mexico and Mississippi Valley. Dutch merchants helped finance the American war effort. This wasn't just a civil war. It was the first global war of the modern age. The Peace of Paris, 1783. Independence, but not equality. After Yorktown, peace negotiations dragged for nearly 2 years. The final Treaty of Paris, 1783, granted recognition of U.S. independence, land from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, fishing rights off Newfoundland, but it offered no protections for native peoples whose lands were promised away. Without their input, loyalists, many of whom were dispossessed or exiled. Enslaved people, many who fought for Britain, were re-enslaved or denied promised freedom. Post-war power struggles. Who won the revolution? A political power shifted from monarchy to elite white landowners, not to the masses. State constitutions varied, but most restricted voting to property-holding men. Revolutionary ideals spurred new political thinking, but full democracy was deferred. Economic inequality, wartime inflation, debt, and profiteering created class resentment. Shays' Rebellion 1786 was sparked by economic distress and unresponsive government, showing that liberty was fragile. X legacy. Myth versus reality. The American Revolution was real. It birthed a nation and inspired revolutions around the world. But its legacy is complicated. Myths that it was fought for all people, that it was the first and only true revolution for liberty, that it was inevitable and pure. Realities. It was also a fight for control, wealth, and elite power. It excluded women, enslaved people, indigenous nations, and poor farmers from its promises. It established a government that would one day go to war many times in the name of freedom, but often in pursuit of power. Reflective, haunting the American Revolution birthed a republic. But it also set a precedent that military force could be used to establish not only liberty, but dominion. From Boston to Yorktown, the dream of liberty marched beside the machinery of conquest. It was a revolution, yes, but a revolution with boundaries, exclusions, and ambitions that would echo for centuries. Was the American Revolution A fight for universal freedom or the first campaign of a new empire? The answer lies not in monuments, but in memory. Securing the Republic 1783 to 1812, part of the series, Liberty or Empire. The real story of America's military conflicts. Reflective tone. The guns fell silent in 1783. Independence was won. But peace would prove more dangerous than war. A fragile republic faced a new threat itself. Would liberty survive in peacetime? Or would internal division, expansionist ambition, and growing military power tear the new nation apart before it could even stand? The fragile peace. A nation untested day. The treaty signed, but unity unsettled with the Treaty of Paris, 1783. Britain recognized American independence, yet the newborn United States was anything but united. The Articles of Confederation offered a weak central government with no power to tax or regulate trade. The Continental Army disbanded amid fears of dictatorship. Many feared that liberty might devolve into anarchy. They had fought to escape empire, but could they govern without becoming one? 2. Domestic conflict, rebellion in the Republica. Veterans, debt, and disillusionment. War left the states heavily in debt. Farmers and veterans returned to find economic collapse, high taxes, and foreclosures. In Massachusetts, farmers led by Daniel Shays launched an uprising in 1786. The state militia fired on its own citizens. Shays' rebellion terrified elites and exposed deep class divisions. It convinced many that the Articles of Confederation had to be REPLACED, be the birth of a stronger state. The Constitution 1787 in 1787. Delegates met in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. It established a stronger federal government, created the presidency, Congress, and Supreme Court, included checks and balances, but excluded the poor, women, and enslaved people. Many feared tyranny again. To ease fears, the Bill of Rights was added. 10 amendments promising protections of speech, religion, and due process. But power had shifted. The Republic was now centralizing. 3. A new government asserts itself, 1789 to 1797a. Washington's presidents, George Washington, the military hero, became the Republic's first president. His challenges: define federal authority, manage foreign threats, prevent internal revolt. His cabinet, with Hamilton Treasury and Jefferson State, reflected clashing visions. Hamilton favored a strong national government and industry. Jefferson defended states' rights and agrarian liberty. B. The Whiskey Rebellion 1794, when Hamilton introduced a whiskey tax. Farmers in Pennsylvania rebelled. Washington led troops to suppress the uprising. It was the first time the new government used force on its own citizens. Liberty demanded order. But how much order was too much? 4. Conflict on the frontier. War with Native Nations. The Northwest Indian War, 1785 to 1795, as settlers pushed west. They clashed with native confederacies in the Ohio Valley. A coalition led by Blue Jacket Shawnee and Little Turtle Miami resisted U.S. expansion. Early U.S. forces suffered humiliating defeats, including St. Clair's defeat 1791. It's the worst in U.S. Army history. President Washington responded with massive force. General Anthony Wayne led a professionalized army to crush the resistance. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers 1794, the Confederacy was decisively defeated. The Treaty of Greenville, 1795, ceded most of Ohio to the U.S. The Revolution may have ended, but conquest was just beginning. V. Foreign entanglements, neutrality, or provocation. A. France versus Britain, the U.S. in the crossfire after 1789. Revolutionary France went to war with Britain. The U.S. tried to stay neutral, but British warships seized American cargo. France demanded support under the 1778 alliance. Washington issued the Neutrality Proclamation 1793, but tensions rose. B. The Jay Treaty 1795. Washington sent John Jay to negotiate with Britain. The treaty averted war, but favored British interests. Jeffersonians saw it as a betrayal of the Revolution. Riots broke out. The young nation was deeply divided between pro-British Federalists and pro-French Republicans, VHI. The Adams Presidency, Fear and Control, 1797 to 1801. The XYZ Affair and the Quasi-War with France in 1797. U.S. envoys went to France. French officials demanded bribes to negotiate the infamous XYZ Affair. Outrage followed. A quasi-war erupted, an undeclared naval conflict in the Caribbean. The U.S. built frigates and fought. French privateers. It was the first major overseas deployment of U.S. military power. B. Domestic crackdown. The Alien and Sedition Acts 1798, fearing internal dissent. President Adams passed sweeping laws. Alien Act allowed deportation of foreigners deemed threats. Sedition Act criminalized criticism of the government. Newspapers were shut down. Political opponents were jailed. Jeffersonians warned. The Republic was becoming authoritarian. In defending liberty, the government had begun to silence it. 7. The Jefferson-era Empire in disguise. 1801 to 1809. A peaceful revolution, 1800. Thomas Jefferson defeated Adams. Power transitioned peacefully, a rare feat in the era. Jefferson promised smaller government and civil liberties, but the contradictions soon emerged. B. The Louisiana Purchase 1803. France, at war again, sold Louisiana to the U.S. for $15 million. It doubled U.S. territory without war. Jefferson, once a strict constitutionalist, used implied powers to justify the deal. Native nations were not consulted. Expansion resumed. Jefferson spoke of liberty, but bought an empire. C. Conflict with Barbary pirates north. African states had long demanded tribute for safe passage of U.S. ships. Jefferson refused, and launched the First Barbary War 1801–1805. The U.S. Navy bombarded Tripoli in America's first overseas land-sea campaign. Victory was limited, but the precedent was clear. America would project power abroad to defend commerce. D. Embargo and economic warfare to avoid war with Britain or France. Jefferson imposed an Embargo Act, 1807, cutting off all foreign trade. The economy collapsed. Smuggling surged. Jefferson, the anti-federalist, now used federal power to enforce unpopular policy. The champion of liberty, now governed by coercion. 8th. Tecumseh and the final native resistance. Rise of a native confederacy. In the early 1800s, Tecumseh, Shawnee, and his brother, the Prophet, led up an Indian resistance. They built a multi-tribal alliance across the Great Lakes, called for rejecting white goods, treaties, and religion. Battle of Tippecanoe, 1811. U.S. forces under William Henry Harrison attacked Prophetstown while Tecumseh was away. The village was destroyed. Tecumseh allied with the British, setting the stage for renewed war. Toward war again. The road to 1812A. Rising tensions with Britain. British ships continued impressing American sailors into the Royal Navy. British forts still stood in U.S. territory. Westerners blamed Britain for stirring native uprisings. A new generation of politicians, the Warhawks, demanded action. Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun led the charge. They saw war not as defense, but as destiny. Reflections on a dangerous decade from 1783 to 1812. The Republic survived but changed. The military expanded. Federal power solidified. The frontier widened through war, treaties, and coercion. Internal dissent was suppressed in the name of unity. In securing the Republic, America had already begun down the path of imperial power. The next war would not just defend borders. It would test the Republic's soul. The Second War for Independence, 1812 to 1815, part of the series, Liberty or Empire. The real story of America's military conflicts, deep, reflective tone 30 years after America declared independence. The Republic once again stood at war with the British Empire. But this was no mere rematch. It was a test of sovereignty, of liberty, and of the young nation's will to endure. Was the War of 1812 a fight to complete the revolution, the opening salvo of a more assertive American empire? The road to war. Tensions resurfacia. British provocations on the high seas. The seeds of war were planted, not on land, but at sea. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain imposed naval blockades against France, disrupting American trade. Impressment? The British Royal Navy forcibly conscripted thousands of American sailors, claiming they were British deserters. Ship seizures. Hundreds of U.S. merchant ships were stopped, boarded, and confiscated. The most infamous incident came in 1807, when the HMS Leopard attacked the USS Chesapeake, killing 3 sailors and wounding 18. 2 Americans. It was a humiliation. To Jeffersonians, it was cause for retribution. Embargo and economic desperation. President Jefferson, hoping to avoid war, enacted the Embargo Act of 1807, cutting off trade with all foreign nations. It crippled American merchants and sailors. Smuggling surged. The economy collapsed particularly. In New England, Jefferson's successor, James Madison, repealed the embargo, but tensions remained. Congress passed non-intercourse acts, tempting to pit Britain and France against each other economically, with little effect. By 1811, war fever was rising. The rise of the Warhawks. New generation of legislators emerged, young, fiery nationalists. Henry Clay of Kentucky. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. They believed British actions insulted American honor and sovereignty. They also coveted Canada as a means to strike Britain and potentially annex new territory. Suppression of Native American resistance in the Northwest, allegedly supported by British agents. Liberty needed to be defended, they said. But liberty was increasingly tied to expansion. The war declared, June 1812. On June 18, 1812, President Madison signed the declaration of war. The vote was deeply divided. Federalists, mostly northeastern merchants, opposed the war. Democratic Republicans supported it as a matter of national pride and independence. The United States, the population of 8 million and a small, underfunded army, faced the world's largest empire. Early blunders. Invasion of Canada. Miscalculated offensive. Madison's administration believed that invading Canada would be easy. Canadians would welcome liberation. British forces, busy fighting Napoleon, would offer little resistance, but reality intervened. American forces were poorly trained and led by aging Revolutionary War veterans. Supply lines were inadequate. The result, DISASTERB defeats at Detroit and Queenston Heights in August 1812. General William Hull surrendered Detroit without firing a shot, believing British troops and their native allies vastly outnumbered him. In October at Queenston Heights, American militia refused to cross into Canada. The U.S. was repelled again. The invasion was not liberation, was humiliation. 4. The native dimension, Tecumseh's War. Rise of the Prophet. And the Confederacy. Before the war began, Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader, had built a multi-tribal confederation to resist U.S. encroachment on indigenous lands. His brother, Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, inspired spiritual revival and anti-American sentiment. B. Battle of Tippecanoe, 1811. General William Henry Harrison led a preemptive strike on Prophetstown, burning it to the ground while Tecumseh was away. The U.S. declared victory. But Tecumseh survived and allied with the British. C. Native alliances and battles throughout the war. Native forces played pivotal roles in the defense of Canada. At Fort Dearborn, Chicago, Potawatomi warriors attacked, retreating U.S. forces, killing dozens. At Thames River, 1813, Tecumseh was killed. His dream of an independent Native Confederation died with him. For indigenous nations, the war was not about British honor, was about survival. V. The Naval War, David vs. Goliath. American success on the seas, though Britain ruled the oceans. The U.S. Navy delivered early victories. The USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, defeated the HMS Guerriere. The USS United States captured the HMS Macedonian. These battles shocked the world. Against all odds, the tiny U.S. Navy punched above its weight. Morale soared. B. Privateers and blockades. Thousands of American privateers harassed British shipping, capturing over 1,300 vessels. But by 1813, the Royal Navy tightened a blockade along the U.S. coast, choking trade and causing economic crisis, especially in New England. Vi. The War in the Northwest and the Great Lakesa. Perry's victory at Lake Erie, 1813, in a crucial engagement. Commodore Oliver Hazard, Perry, defeated the British fleet at Lake Erie. We have met the enemy, and they are ours. He reported this secured the Northwest for the U.S. and enabled victory at Battle of the Thames, where Tecumseh died. B. The Niagara Campaign in 1814. The U.S. launched another campaign into Canada. Lundy's Lane and Chippewa were bloody but inconclusive. American troops eventually withdrew. Despite gains, Canada would remain British. VIA. Disaster strikes. The burning of WAS Chiangi-Toanin, August 1814. British troops landed in Maryland and marched on the capital. At Bladensburg, American defenses collapsed. British troops entered Washington, D.C., burned the White House, Capitol, and other buildings. Madison and Congress fled. A thunderstorm and tornado put out the fires. It was the greatest humiliation since the Revolution. The Capitol lay in ashes. 8. Resistance at Baltimore, the birth of an anathema. Fort McHenry, September 1814, as the British turned north. They attacked Baltimore by land and sea. But at Fort McHenry, American defenders held out under 25 hours of bombardment. As dawn broke, the U.S. flag still flew, seen by prisoner of war Francis Scott Key, who penned a poem, "Oh Say, Can You See?" It became the Star-Spangled Banner. IX, the Southern Theater. Creek War and New Orleans. The Creek Civil War. In the South, the U.S. faced the Red Stick Creeks, a militant faction opposing U.S. expansion in Alabama and Georgia. Led by Manawa and Peter McQueen, U.S. forces, under Andrew Jackson, defeated them at Horseshoe Bend, 1814, killing over 800. The Treaty of Fort Jackson forced the Creek to cede 23 million acres, most of modern-day Alabama, Battle of New Orleans, January 1815, British forces launched a major attack on New Orleans. Jackson's ragtag army, including militia, freedmen, pirates, and native allies, built defenses. On January 8, 1815, they repelled the British with staggering losses. 2,000 British killed or wounded, compared to 71 Americans. Irony. The battle occurred after peace had been negotiated, but news had not yet reached the front. It was a pointless bloodbath, yet it made Jackson a national hero. Peace and ambiguity. The Treaty of Ghent, 1814, signed on December 24, 1814. The Treaty of Ghent ended the war. No territory changed hands. Impressment and trade disputes were left unresolved. Native allies were abandoned by both sides. It was a draw. But in America, it was hailed as a second independence. 11. The aftermath, myth, memory. And Meninga. Winners and losers. The U.S. military gained prestige and professionalism. Native nations suffered catastrophic losses and accelerated dispossession. The Federalist Party, which had opposed the war and even flirted with secession at the Hartford Convention. COLLAPSED. The rise of nationalism. Jackson's victory at New Orleans forged a new American hero. War heroes like William Henry Harrison and Winfield Scott would shape future wars. The myth of the Second War for Independence cemented national pride. The era of good feelings. The post-war years saw political unity and expansion. But behind the scenes, slavery expanded into new Western territories. Native removal escalated. Military infrastructure grew. America turned its gaze toward Florida, Texas, and beyond. Independence had been secured. But the age of expansion of empire was now underway. Final narration, reflective tone. The War of 1812 began as a defense of sovereignty. It ended as a projection of ambition. It was a war of contradictions. Liberty spoken on one tongue, conquest waged by the other. And yet, from the ashes of Washington and the swamps of New Orleans, a new America emerged, prouder, stronger, and more determined to dominate its future. The Republic had survived. But at what cost and for what purpose? Empire at the edges. Florida, Texas, and Indian removal, 1815 to 1846, from the series Liberty or Empire. The real story of America's military conflicts. Somber, reflective tone. They called it a Republic of Liberty. But between the Revolution and the Civil War, the United States expanded its reach with a force no less imperial than those it once opposed. From the swamps of Florida to the plains of Texas, and through the tear-soaked paths of native exodus, America reshaped the continent not just through ideals, but through war, displacement, and domination. This is the story of liberties. Darker twin, empire. The post-1812 ambition. A nation hungry for land. America's new confidence. After the War of 1812, the United States emerged with a powerful sense of destiny. National pride surged. The military gained prestige. Frontiersmen, planters, and politicians now pushed west and south. The Empire of Liberty, as Jefferson had called it, began to resemble a traditional empire territorial military. An expansionist. Expansion as policy by 1815. The U.S. had defeated native resistance in the Midwest. Spain's hold on Florida weakened. Texas, part of Mexico, beckoned settlers hungry for land. The borders of the Republic were no longer boundaries, they were invitations. 2. Florida, war, diplomacy, and occupation. Florida, a haven and a target at war's end. Spanish Florida was a geopolitical mess. Runaway enslaved people found refuge there. Seminole tribes welcomed them. British agents and pirates used it as a base. The U.S. saw this as a threat. B. The First Seminole War 1817–1818. Under orders from Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, General Andrew Jackson invaded Florida. Burned Seminole villages. Executed 2 British citizens, causing an international crisis. Captured Spanish forts at Pensacola and St. Mark's. Washington was shocked. Jackson had gone beyond his orders, but public opinion hailed him as a hero. Jackson didn't just fight the Seminoles. He undermined Spain, exposed British vulnerability, and expanded U.S. military precedent. See Adams' Onis Treaty 1819. Spain, weakened and distracted by colonial revolutions, ceded Florida in exchange for U.S. renunciation of claims. 2. Texas, a temporary promise. U.S. assumption of $5 million in citizen claims against Spain. Florida became U.S. territory in 1821. 3. The Seminoles, war without end. Who were the Seminoles? A confederation of Creek refugees, runaway enslaved Africans called Black Seminoles, and others who settled in Florida. Fiercely independent, resistant to treaties, seen as a threat to slaveholders and expansionists. B. Second Seminole War, 1835–1842. Sparked by the refusal to accept forced removal under the Indian Removal Act, 1830. Seminole leader Osceola led guerrilla resistance. U.S. troops fought in swamps and forests. The war became the longest and costliest Indian war in U.S. history. Tactics included scorched earth, capturing families to force surrender. Deceit. Osceola was captured under a flag of truce by 1842. Thousands of Seminoles were killed or exiled to Oklahoma. A few hundred remained hidden in the Everglades. The war never truly ended. Only the headlines did. 4. Indian removal, a national policy of displacement. The Indian Removal Act, 1830, championed by President Andrew Jackson. The act authorized the federal government to exchange native-held lands in the East for lands west of the Mississippi. Framed as voluntary, but enforced through coercion. Signed overwhelmingly by Congress despite fierce opposition from Davy Crockett and others. It was democracy weaponized majority rule used to erase minorities. B. Cherokee resistance. Cherokee Nation tried a legal route, adopted a constitution, written language, and legal codes. Sued the U.S. in Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, and won. But Jackson reportedly defied the Supreme Court. John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. He is alleged to have SAID see the Trail of Tears, 1838–1839, under President Martin Van Buren. Federal troops rounded up 16,000 Cherokee. Forced march of over 1,000 miles to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Thousands died from disease, exposure, and starvation. Similar fates awaited the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations. It was not just removal, it was expulsion, exile, and erasure. V. Texas, expansion's most explosive frontier. Origins of Anglo-Texasin, the 1820s. Mexico invited Anglo settlers to populate Tejos, a sparsely settled northern province. Settlers like Stephen F. Austin brought thousands of families. Many brought enslaved people, defying Mexican abolition laws. Tensions grew. B. Rising tensions with Mexico by the 1830s. Mexico sought to centralize control under President Santa Anna. Texans resisted efforts to end slavery and enforce Mexican customs. In 1835, Revolt BEG-ANC. The Texas Revolution, 1835–1836. Battle of the Alamo. Mexican forces killed all defenders, including Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. Goliad Massacre, over 300 captured rebels were executed. Battle of San Jacinto. General Sam Houston surprised and defeated. Santa Ana, Texas declared independence in 1836, becoming the Republic of Texas. A revolution, yes, but also a war to preserve slavery and Anglo control. Vi. The Texas. Question: to annex or not to annex? A. Texas as a republic, 1836 to 1845. Texas requested annexation by the U.S. northern states, opposed it fearing a new slave state and war with Mexico. Presidents Van Buren and Jackson delayed. Texas remained independent for nearly a decade, struggling with debt, diplomatic isolation, and internal unrest. B. Manifest destiny emerges by the 1840s. A new ideology took hold. Manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined by God to expand across the continent. It fused nationalism, racism, and expansionism into a political force. Destiny justified desire, and desire justified domination. 7. The borderlands heat up. Mexico, slavery, and war. The election of 1844, James K. Polk, an ardent expansionist, won the presidency, promising to annex Texas, settle the Oregon boundary, acquire California in 1845. Congress approved Texas annexation. Mexico severed diplomatic ties. B. Prelude to the Mexican-American War. Polk sent troops under Zachary Taylor to the Rio Grande. Into disputed territory, skirmishes broke out. Polk claimed American blood was shed on American soil and asked Congress for war. It was a war of liberty wrapped in a lie. The empire was moving again. 8. The military machine. Grousa. Army reform and power projection. Between 1815 and 1846, the U.S. Army became more professional. West Point graduates filled command ranks. Campaigns in Florida, Texas, and Indian Territory gave officers battlefield experience. Figures like Winfield Scott, Zachary Taylor, and Jefferson Davis cut their teeth in these conflicts. The seeds of the Civil War and future imperial ventures were planted here. IX. Themes and legacies. Liberty versus conquest, expansion, was framed as freedom liberating Florida from Spain, Texas from Mexico. But it meant dispossession for Native Americans, enslaved people, and Mexicans. B. Race and power removal and war were justified by racial superiority and civilizing missions. The U.S. codified white supremacy into policy through slavery, land seizure, and political exclusion. C. The hidden cost: tens of thousands died in these wars and removals. Entire nations disappeared from their ancestral lands. American ideals survived but were reshaped by what they enabled. Liberty marched across rivers, through forests, and over bodies, and few stopped to ask what it was trampling. Haunting reflection: the United States had fought Britain to escape empire, but built one of its own at the edges. Florida was seized, Texas revolted, nations were uprooted, and all was done in the name of freedom. The cost was high, not just in blood, but in the moral contradictions the nation would carry forward. The empire was no longer at the edges. It was now part of the American heart. The war that changed the border. U.S. versus Mexico. 1846 to 1848, part of the series, Liberty or Empire. The real story of America's military conflicts, slow, introspective tone in the mid-19th century. Two nations shared a border and a deep misunderstanding. One believed in its divine destiny to expand. The other in defending its sovereignty at all costs. What followed was a war that redrew maps, redefined power, and revealed the true reach of American ambition. This is the story of the U.S.-Mexico War, the war that changed the border and changed America. Origins of the conflict. Destiny meets Desarea. Manifest destiny takes hold in the 1840s. The United States embraced a powerful ideology, manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were divinely ordained to spread across the North American continent. It combined nationalism, racism, and Protestant mission with hunger for land. It was not just a dream, it was a plan. A plan with flags and rifles. B. The Texas question reignites in 1836. Texas had declared independence from Mexico after a violent revolt. For a decade, it existed as an independent republic heavily influenced by U.S. settlers and slaveholders. Mexico never recognized its independence and warned that annexation would mean war. In 1845, the U.S. annexed Texas, claiming its border extended to the Rio Grande far beyond the Nueces River, which Mexico recognized as the boundary. C. Provocation. In disguise, President James K. Polk, a staunch expansionist, sent Zachary Taylor and 4,000 troops into the disputed territory between the two rivers. On April 25, 1846, Mexican cavalry attacked a U.S. patrol, killing 11. Polk seized the moment. American blood has been shed on American soil, he declared. Congress declared war on May 13, 1846. But whose soil was it? And whose blood would be shed next? Two early battles in Texas. The Northern Frontier. Battle of Palo Alto, May 8, 1846, Taylor's outnumbered troops met Mexican General Mariano Arista near modern Brownsville, Texas. U.S. artillery proved decisive. Mexican forces retreated after heavy LOSS-ESB Battle of Resaca de la Palma. May 9, Taylor pursued Arista across a dry riverbed. Fierce hand-to-hand combat. U.S. troops captured Mexican artillery and forced a full retreat into Matamoros. With two swift victories, the U.S. declared its might. But Mexico had not yet begun to fight. 3. The war expands. The Southern Front opened California and New Mexico campaigns while Taylor held the North. Polk expanded the war. Stephen W. Kearny led troops westward to seize Santa Fe without a shot. John C. Fremont, aided by U.S. Navy forces, sparked the Bear Flag Revolt in California. By mid-1847, all of northern Mexico's far territories, California and New Mexico, were under U.S. control. The empire grew by shadow war. Declared here, but conquest everywhere. B. Political tensions at home. Many question the war's purpose. Abraham Lincoln, then a congressman, demanded to know the exact spot where blood was shed, calling Polk's motives deceitful. Henry David Thoreau refused to pay taxes in protest, writing civil disobedience. Frederick Douglass condemned the war as a slaveholders' campaign for empire. Even within the halls of democracy, voices cried out. This was conquest, not defense. 4. Campaigns deep into Mexico. Battle of Monterrey, September 1846. Taylor marched into northeastern Mexico, capturing the fortified city of Monterrey. Urban warfare erupted, house-to-house fighting. A truce allowed Mexican forces to withdraw, drawing criticism from Washington. Polk, growing suspicious of Taylor's popularity, diverted attention to a new front. B. Entered General Winfield Scott. Polk authorized Winfield Scott to launch a bold amphibious assault on Mexico's east coast. Goal: march to Mexico City. End the war swiftly. Scott assembled the most professional force the U.S. had ever fielded. Many were West Point graduates who would later fight each other in the Civil WARV, the March to Mexico City. Siege of Veracruz. March 1847, Scott landed 10,000 troops in the first major amphibious operation in U.S. history. After a 2-week siege, Veracruz surrendered. Civilian casualties were high due to disease, starvation, and bombardment. The war had left the frontier. Now, it battered the heart of another nation. B. Battles of Cerro Gordo, Contreras, and Churubusco. Scott's army advanced over the rugged interior. At Cerro Gordo, they outflanked Santa Anna's 12,000-strong army. At Churubusco, U.S. forces faced fierce resistance from the San Patricios. Irish immigrants who had defected from the U.S. Army to fight for Mexico, captured San Patricios, were hanged. C. Battle of Molino del Rey and Chapultepec. September 1847. As they neared the capital, U.S. troops stormed Chapultepec Castle, defended by teenage Mexican cadets, the Niños Heroes, now national martyrs. U.S. Marines raised the flag over the castle and pushed into Mexico City. By mid-September, the capital was occupied. Via occupation, resistance, and reprisals. American control with Mexico's capital in U.S. hands. Looting and misconduct by U.S. troops embarrassed commanders. Martial law was declared. Guerrilla resistance continued across the countryside. B. The cost to civilians: tens of thousands of Mexican civilians died. Churches, homes, and businesses were desecrated. Racialized violence surged. Angler soldiers viewed Mexican civilians as inferior. Liberty marched through the streets of Mexico City, but its boots were heavy with blood. 7. The treaty that changed everything. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, February 2, 1848. Under pressure, Mexico signed a treaty ceding 500,000 square miles of territory, modern California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The U.S. paid $15 million and assumed some Mexican debts. The border moved from the Nueces to the Rio Grande. B. Promises made. Promises broken. The treaty promised U.S. citizenship to Mexicans in the new territories. Property rights were to be respected. In reality, land grants were often ignored or seized through legal trickery. Tejanos and Californios were marginalized and disenfranchised. Racism and violence became daily facts of life. The ink was dry, but the wounds were just beginning to bleed. 8. The war's legacy in Mexico. A nation humiliated. Mexico lost over half its territory. Its army was shattered. Its economy was crippled. The war left scars that remain today's sense of betrayal, occupation, and dispossession. B. The rise of Mexican nationalism and defeat. Mexican identity began to consolidate. The Niños Heroes became symbols of resistance. U.S. actions hardened anti-American sentiment. Future leaders, including Benito Juarez, would rise to challenge foreign domination. The war's legacy in the United States. Military lessons. West Point graduates like Grant, Lee, Meade, and Sherman gained battlefield experience that would shape the Civil War. Logistics, amphibious operations, and occupation became part of U.S. doctrine. B. Political earthquake. The addition of vast new territories reignited the slavery debate. Would slavery expand into the new lands? The Wilmot Proviso tried and failed to block slavery's spread. The war answered one question: who owns the land? But it opened another: who owns the people? C. The shadow of empire. The U.S. emerged as a continental power. A precedent was set. War could serve expansion. Mexico was humbled. Native peoples were further isolated. The map was redrawn by force. It was not the last time the U.S. would fight a weaker nation to claim a larger prize. X. Concluding reflections. The U.S.-Mexico War was a turning point, a war of ambition disguised as security. Conquest wrapped in democracy. It tested the American soul and revealed how easily liberty could become an instrument of empire. The border changed. The balance of power changed. And America now, a continental empire, was just getting started. Slavery's March, the military prequel to Civil War, 1848 to 1860, part of the series. liberty or empire. The real story of America's military conflicts, solemnous, reflective tone. The Mexican War ended with the American flag flying over half a continent. But victory came at a price. Every acre gained reopened the old wound of slavery. Between 1848 and 1860, the United States fought not foreign armies but itself. In courtrooms and border towns, in the halls of Congress and on the plains of Kansas. The Union cracked, law faltered, and the military was drawn into domestic chaos. This was the war before the war, the march of slavery, and the battles. To stop it? From Conquest to Conflict, 1848A, The Shadow of the Mexican Cession. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo added 500,000 square miles to the U.S., but left an open question. Would slavery be allowed in the new territories? David Wilmot proposed banning its sparking fury among slaveholders. The Wilmot Proviso failed, but the debate exploded. The battlefield had moved into Congress and into the soul of the Republic. B. The Compromise of 1850 crafted. By Henry Clay, the compromise attempted to defuse the crisis. California admitted as a free state. Territorial status for Utah and New Mexico, with slavery undecided. Slave trade banned in D.C. BT slavery remained legal. A new, stricter Fugitive Slave Act imposed federal enforcement. Liberty had won California, but slavery gained the power of federal law. 2. The militarization of slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act, a federal mandate for re-enslavement. 1850 Fugitive Slave Act mandated that all escaped enslaved persons be returned to their owners' haven from free states. Denied accused fugitives a jury trial. Punished officials and citizens who refused to help capture them. This turned federal marshals and QS troops into slavery's enforcers. B. Military and militia involvement. U.S. Army troops were deployed to Boston, Cincinnati, and Syracuse to enforce slave captures. Anthony Burns, captured in Boston in 1854, was escorted by 2,000 federal troops. Local militias were mobilized to suppress abolitionist resistance. Freedom meant nothing if soldiers marched to silence it. C. Resistance and underground. War. The Underground Railroad expanded dramatically. Vigilante mobs liberated captured fugitives. Abolitionists clashed with marshals, often violently. The U.S. government, in trying to preserve peace, was now using military force to sustain human bondage. 3. Bleeding Kansas. The border war begins. Kansas-Nebraska. Act 1854 proposed by Stephen Douglas. The act repealed the Missouri Compromise. Allowed territories to decide slavery by popular sovereignty. This made Kansas a battleground. If the people would choose, then both sides would send their armies. B. Two governments. One territory. Pro-slavery Missourians flooded Kansas to vote illegally, setting up a puppet legislature. Free Soilers formed a rival government in Topeka. By 1856, Kansas had two constitutions, two capitals, and rising violence. See the sack of Lawrence and Pottawatomie massacre in May 1856. Pro-slavery forces burned Lawrence, a free state town. Days later, John Brown and his sons retaliated, murdering 5 pro-slavery settlers. The border became a war zone. D. Federal inaction and U.S. Army. President Pierce and Buchanan refused to intervene on behalf of anti-slavery settlers. The U.S. Army, under orders, tried to maintain neutrality, but often protected pro-slavery leaders. By 1858, over 200 people had died. Kansas bled not just from bullets, but from a government that stood by with folded arms. For the military divided soldiers, causes, and future generals. West Point graduates faced the crisis. Many U.S. Army officers were veterans of the Mexican War and now faced a moral test. Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman, and others served in the frontier army, witnessing the nation's fracture. Most remained publicly neutral but quietly chose sides. The future Civil War wasn't just political, it was already forming in mess halls, garrisons, and border skirmishes. B. Native conflicts continue, while slavery tore the Union apart. The U.S. Army continued campaigns against native tribes in the West. The Yuma War, the Ute conflicts, and the Navajo Long Walk all began or escalated in this period. Black troops' Buffalo Soldiers were not yet active, but the military built outposts in Colorado, Texas, and Utah. Even as the country fought itself, it expanded militarily into indigenous homelands, courtrooms, and compromises. Collapse. Dred Scott Decision 1857. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, sued for freedom after being taken into free territory. The Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Roger Taney, ruled Black Americans were not citizens. Congress had no power to ban slavery in any territory. This invalidated decades of compromise. The court didn't just side with slavery, declared it unchallengeable. B. Northern backlash. The decision radicalized the North. Republican Party gained strength, founded in 1854 on anti-slavery expansion. Abraham Lincoln, a little-known lawyer, emerged as a key voice in debates with Douglas. He warned, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." The courts had spoken. The people were preparing to answer. Vi. John Brown, the First Civil War. A Harper's Ferry raid, October 1859. John Brown, already infamous from Kansas, led 21 men, black and white, to seize the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan: spark a mass slave uprising. Arm the enslaved from the captured arsenal. B. Federal response. Local militia and U.S. Marines under Robert E. Lee surrounded and stormed the armory. 10 raiders were killed. Brown was captured, wounded but defiant, tried and hanged for treason. Brown became a martyr to abolitionists and a terrorist to slaveholders. The war before the war had found its blood prophet. 7. The last shred of Uniona. 1860 election. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency on an anti-slavery expansion platform. He won no Southern states. The South saw this as a declaration of war on their way of life. Within weeks, South Carolina seceded. B. The Army caught in the middle. Southern officers began resigning commissions. Federal forts, like Fort Sumter, became flashpoints. President Buchanan refused to act decisively. The military, loyal to a fractured government, stood helpless. It would not be long before they took up arms against each other. 8. Themes and legacies. The federal military's role in slavery enforced slave laws, protected Southern power, suppressed abolitionist resistance. The U.S. Army, bound to executive orders, became an instrument of oppression even as some officers abhorred ITB slaveries. Territorial ambitions. Southerners sought to expand slavery to Cuba, Central America, and the American West. The Army's job was to clear obstacles: native resistance, abolitionist uprisings, legal barriers. This was not just defense of slavery. It was the expansion of an empire built on bondage. C. America's quiet Civil War. Before Fort Sumter, hundreds had died in Kansas. Militias were mobilized. Federal troops fired on citizens. In Boston and Harper's Ferry, the Civil War had already begun, just lacked the name. Final narration: cold. Reflective. The United States won a continent in the 1840s, but lost its unity in the attempt to decide who would rule it and how. This was not a peaceful decade. It was a military decade of raids, patrols, fugitives, and militias. It was a war for the future of slavery, of the Republic, and of what liberty really meant. And soon it would become an open war. The war for union and emancipation 1861 to 1865, Liberty or Empire. The real story of America's military conflicts, the American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, remains the most defining and devastating conflict in the nation's history. It was not merely a clash of armies, but a profound struggle over the future of the United States, the survival of the Union itself, and the fate of millions enslaved. What began as a constitutional crisis over states' rights and slavery quickly evolved into a total war that would reshape American society, politics, and identity. This chapter examines the war in full scope, the secession crisis that fractured the nation, the bloodiest battles that decided its outcome, the transformative Emancipation Proclamation that redefined its purpose, the courageous role of black soldiers, Lincoln's leadership amid unprecedented challenges, and the turbulent aftermath that would shape Reconstruction and beyond. The outbreak of war and the secession crisis, the seeds of America's deadliest war, were sown decades before 1861, with sectional tensions rooted in the institution of slavery, economic differences, and disputes over state sovereignty. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act each attempted to quell conflict, but instead intensified passions, particularly over whether new territories would allow slavery. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 triggered an immediate crisis. Lincoln, representing the newly formed Republican Party, ran on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery into new territories, which Southern leaders saw as an existential threat to their social and economic order. By December 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, collectively forming the Confederate States of America under Jefferson Davis. The South justified secession on grounds of states' rights and the protection of slavery. Viewing the Union's authority as oppressive, efforts at compromise failed. And when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the nation plunged into civil war. Lincoln's call for volunteers to suppress the rebellion galvanized the North but also pushed for more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, to the Confederacy. The Union faced a war unlike any before, to preserve itself, and to answer the moral and political question of slavery once and for all. The Road to Global Superpower, 1939 to 1945, Liberty or Empire. The real story of America's military conflicts, World War II, reshaped the world order and cemented the United States' position as a global superpower. After years of isolationism, America's entry into the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor marked a decisive break from its previous foreign policy. This conflict was often called the Good War, a fight against the evils of fascism and genocide, but beneath the surface lay difficult moral questions about the use of strategic bombings, the internment of Japanese Americans, and the unprecedented devastation of atomic weapons. This chapter provides a comprehensive examination of the military campaigns, political decisions, societal impacts, and the war's lasting legacy on the United States and the global stage. 1. Isolationism and the road to war. Background of American isolationism. Post-World War I disillusionment, the Neutrality Acts, and public reluctance to enter foreign conflicts. Rise of fascist regimes, Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, and militarist Japan threatening global peace. Lend-Lease and support to allies. Gradual erosion of neutrality through aid to Britain and the Soviet Union. Pearl Harbor attack, December 7, 1941. Catalyst that shattered isolationism and propelled the U.S. into War II. The Good War, fighting fascism and the Holocaust War aims. Defeat of Axis powers and the preservation of democratic values. The Holocaust, American awareness and response to Nazi genocide. Alliance with the Soviet Union, complex partnership with Stalin against a common enemy. Mobilization of American industry and society. The arsenal of democracy, rationing, and total war economy. 3. Major military campaigns and strategies. Europe, North Africa. Italy, D-Day invasion of Normandy, push into Germany. Pacific Island hopping campaign. Battles of Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Strategic bombing. The Allied bombing campaigns over Germany and Japan, including controversial firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo. 4. Japanese-American internment. Executive Order 9066. The forced relocation and imprisonment of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans. Legal and moral controversies, impact on civil liberties, lasting effects on Japanese American communities. Legacy, redress, and formal apologies decades later. 5. The atomic bomb and its aftermath. Manhattan Project. Development of nuclear weapons in secret. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Use of atomic bombs and immediate effects. Debate. Liberation from prolonged war or unprecedented terror. Impact on international relations. Beginning of the nuclear age and its Cold War dynamics. 6. America's emergence as a global superpower. Military dominance. Largest and most advanced armed forces in the world. Economic transformation. From Great Depression to economic powerhouse. Creation of international institutions. United Nations, Bretton Woods system. The Cold War seeds. Confrontation with Soviet Union shaping post-war policy. Cold War conflicts and proxy battles 1947 to 1989. Liberty or empire. The real story of America's military conflicts. A1. The Truman Doctrine and Containment Strategy, the Post-War World, and the Rise of Bipolarity. The Aftermath of World War II. The global order that emerged was dramatically different from the one that preceded the conflict. The United States and the Soviet Union, former uneasy allies against Nazi Germany, quickly transformed into rival superpowers locked in a tense ideological and geopolitical struggle known as the Cold War. The war had devastated much of Europe and Asia, leaving power vacuums and fragile states vulnerable to influence from either bloc. American policymakers faced a daunting question: how to prevent the spread of Soviet communism without triggering a new global conflict. This dilemma shaped the contours of U.S. foreign policy for the next 4 decades. The Truman Doctrine, a new policy of global engagement, March 12, 1947. President Harry S. Truman addressed Congress, requesting aid for Greece and Turkey too. Nations facing internal unrest and external pressure from communist forces. In this speech, Truman articulated what would become the cornerstone of American Cold War policy. It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. This commitment came to be known as the Truman Doctrine and marked a decisive break from prior American isolationism. The doctrine framed the Cold War as a global contest between freedom and tyranny, democracy and communism, positing that the survival of free peoples anywhere was linked to the security of the United States. Congress swiftly approved $400 million in aid for Greece and Turkey, enabling them to suppress communist insurgencies and resist Soviet influence. More broadly, the Truman Doctrine committed the U.S. to a policy of containment, aimed at preventing the further expansion of Soviet power beyond Eastern Europe. Containment or expansion. A policy with ambiguities, the strategy of containment. First, articulated by diplomat George F. Kennan in his famous Long Telegram and later in his anonymous Foreign Affairs article under the pseudonym X, called for patient, vigilant resistance to Soviet expansionism through political, economic, and military means. While containment was presented as a defensive posture, critics argue that it became a pretext for aggressive American interventionism. The U.S. increasingly justified involvement in foreign conflicts, and regime changes as necessary to prevent the spread of communism, often without clear regard for the sovereignty or desires of other nations. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, exemplified this dual nature, ostensibly designed to rebuild war-ravaged European economies and prevent the rise of communist parties. It also solidified Western Europe as a U.S. sphere of influence and deepened the ideological divide with the Soviet bloc. Early challenges and global commitments. The Truman Doctrine and containment policy forced the U.S. into new global commitments. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, established in 1949, institutionalized a collective defense pact among Western nations. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union consolidated its control over Eastern Europe, forming the Warsaw Pact in 1955 in response to the ideological and military standoff shaped American political discourse and military planning throughout the Cold War. The U.S. built a large, peacetime military establishment and established a network of bases around the world. Desert Storm and the Unipolar Moment, 1990 to 2001. Liberty or Empire. The real story of America's military conflicts. The end of the Cold War left the United States as the world's sole superpower, ushering in what scholars call the unipolar moment. Yet this new status came with complex challenges and military engagements that revealed the limits of American power and the volatility of global politics. The 1991 Gulf War showcased a decisive but tightly managed projection of U.S. military strength. Meanwhile, operations in Somalia highlighted the perils of intervention in failed states. During this period, the seeds of future conflict were sown as extremist groups like Al-Qaeda gained ground amid global instability. 1. The Gulf War. Defending Kuwait or protecting oil. Background: Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990 shocked the world and threatened regional stability. U.S. response: Operation Desert Shield and the coalition buildup to repel Iraqi forces. Operation Desert Storm. The swift air and ground campaign beginning in January 1991. Military technology and strategy. Precision bombing, overwhelming force, and real-time media coverage. Motivations debated. Was the war primarily about defending Kuwait's sovereignty or securing American access to oil resources? Aftermath: Hussein's regime weakened but remained in power. Regional tensions persisted to Somalia and the Black Hawk Down moment. Background: Somalia's civil war and humanitarian crisis drew UN and U.S. peacekeeping efforts in the early 1990s. Operation Restore Hope. U.S.-led mission to secure aid delivery amid chaos. Battle of Mogadishu, 1993. Intense urban combat, downing of Black Hawk helicopters, and casualties. Impact: public outrage, withdrawal of U.S. forces, and a re-evaluation of intervention policies. Legacy: influenced U.S. reluctance to intervene in future humanitarian crises. 3. The rise of Al-Qaeda. Amid global instability. Origins: Al-Qaeda's foundation by Osama bin Laden in the late 1980s amid the Afghan jihad against the Soviet invasion. Anti-American sentiment. U.S. support for regimes in the Middle East. Presence of troops in Saudi Arabia and Israeli-Palestinian conflict fueling resentment. Early attacks. Bombings of U.S. embassies in Africa and the USS Cole. Intelligence. Warnings, growing awareness, but lack of coherent counter-terrorism strategy. Setting the stage for 9/11s. How the 1990s foreshadowed the next major phase of conflict. The War on Terror. Endless War. 2001 to 2021. Liberty or Empire. The real story of America's military conflicts. The attacks on September 11, 2001. Shattered the sense of security that many Americans had long taken for granted. These coordinated strikes by Al-Qaeda not only caused unprecedented loss of life, but also launched the United States into a vast, complex, and prolonged global conflict known as the War on Terror. Unlike previous wars fought between states on clearly defined battlefields, this new conflict involved non-state actors, guerrilla tactics, and sprawling theaters across multiple continents. Over 2 decades, it would profoundly alter U.S. military strategy, foreign policy, civil liberties, and international relations. This chapter examines the origins of the War on Terror, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the controversial use of drone warfare, domestic surveillance programs, and the eventual withdrawal from Afghanistan. Throughout the war raises challenging questions about power, security, morality, and the limits of American influence in the 21st century. 1. 9/11s. And the invasion of Afghanistan, the September 11th attacks, a nation under siege on the morning of September 11, 2001. 19 militants associated with the Islamist terrorist group Al-Qaeda hijacked for commercial airplanes, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center towers in New York City, 1 into the Pentagon near Washington, D.C., and a 4th into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers attempted to retake control. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in the deadliest terrorist attack on U.S. soil. The shock of 9/11s galvanized the nation and the world. For Americans, the attacks marked a profound rupture, a brutal awakening to new threats, emerging from global terrorism rather than traditional state-based wars. The Bush administration's response and the global war on terror in the immediate aftermath. President George W. Bush declared a war on terror, vowing to hunt down those responsible and dismantle terrorist networks worldwide. The administration focused first on Afghanistan, where the Taliban regime had provided sanctuary to al-Qaeda's leadership, including Osama bin Laden. Congress swiftly authorized military force. In October 2001, Operation Enduring Freedom commenced, a coalition effort primarily led by U.S. forces, alongside NATO allies and local Afghan opposition groups like the Northern Alliance to overthrow the Taliban and eliminate Qaeda's bases. Early military campaign and nation-building challenges. The initial invasion was militarily successful. Taliban forces collapsed quickly, and key al-Qaeda figures fled or were captured. However, the Taliban's insurgency soon resurged, exploiting Afghanistan's rugged terrain and complex tribal dynamics. What followed was a prolonged counterinsurgency campaign marked by shifting strategies, frequent combat operations, and efforts to rebuild Afghan political and security institutions. Despite billions in aid and years of military presence, challenges persisted, including corruption, weak governance, and regional rivalries, all complicating America's objectives. Today's battles and tomorrow's questions. 2021 present, liberty or empire. The real story of America's military conflicts as the world moves deeper into the 21st century. The nature of military conflict continues to evolve in unprecedented ways. Traditional battlefields have given way to shadow wars fought in cyberspace, proxy conflicts played out in distant regions, and a rapid technological revolution reshaping how wars are fought. Against this backdrop, the United States faces a complex global environment marked by rising powers, persistent instability, and difficult choices about its role in world affairs. This chapter explores the defining features of contemporary military engagement, the proxy wars that test alliances and rivalries, the invisible but potent realm of cyber warfare, the rise of artificial intelligence and advanced technologies, and the political and economic tensions underpinning defense spending. Central to this discussion is the enduring question confronting U.S. foreign and military policy. Is America defending democracy or primarily seeking to preserve its global dominance? 1. Proxy wars and geopolitical flashpoints. The Ukraine conflict, a new front in global rivalry. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, dramatically escalating a conflict that, began in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and support for separatists in eastern Ukraine. The war quickly became a focal point of global attention, lighting the fragile post-Cold War order and the risks of great power competition. The United States and its NATO allies responded by providing extensive military aid, intelligence, and economic sanctions against Russia. This support was aimed at bolstering Ukraine's defense capabilities and deterring further Russian aggression. The conflict also exposed deep divisions within Europe about security and energy dependence, reshaping geopolitical alliances. The war in Ukraine has been characterized by a brutal conventional fight, high civilian casualties, and profound humanitarian crises. It has revived fears of escalation between nuclear powers, pushing the world toward renewed caution, but also demonstrating the limits of diplomatic resolution in such entrenched conflicts. Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific. Rising tensions with China. The Taiwan Strait has become one of the most sensitive flashpoints in contemporary geopolitics. China's increasing military assertiveness and its claims over Taiwan have alarmed regional neighbors and the U.S., which maintains a policy of strategic ambiguity supporting Taiwan's defense without explicit security guarantees. The United States has strengthened military partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. It's conducting freedom of navigation operations and increasing arms sales to Taiwan and allies like Japan and Australia. These moves are designed to deter Chinese aggression but also risk escalating tensions. Taiwan's status is emblematic of the broader contest between the U.S. and China for influence in the region and globally. The balance of power here will likely shape international security in the coming decades. Persistent instability in the Middle East. The Middle East remains a region fraught with conflict and competing interests. Civil wars in Syria and Yemen, the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran have created a volatile environment where the U.S. continues to be deeply involved. American policy has shifted somewhat toward reduced direct military intervention, emphasizing counterterrorism and support for partners. However, the region's strategic importance, especially in energy and security, keeps it central to U.S. military planning. Proxy battles, sectarian violence, and shifting alliances mean that the Middle East will remain a hotspot, testing the limits of American influence and patience. Expanding influence in Africa and beyond traditional hotspots. The U.S. has increased its military and diplomatic presence in Africa, responding to terrorism threats from groups like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram. This expansion reflects a recognition that key security challenges are increasingly diffuse and interconnected. Operations focus on training, intelligence sharing, and limited strikes, avoiding large-scale deployments. However, this raises questions about the long-term impact of such engagements on regional stability and perceptions of American presence.